Okay, first of all, Valentine's Day. So this slide is pertinent, and you'll see in a minute why. So they're somewhere. They're hidden Easter eggs. They're in the cloud, yeah. Cloud cupcakes. Okay, so the reason I showed you the cupcakes will become apparent in a minute. So, but first, let's go back to when we were at school. For some of us, that's quite a long time ago. But you'll remember we did some basic math, where we did 2 plus 2 and 5 times 5, and that was cool. But then things started to get a little bit complicated and a bit more serious. And we were told that Mary went shopping and bought a whole bunch of stuff. And then she came home and did some baking. She baked up a storm, right? And then we were asked to calculate the cost of one cupcake from all of those ingredients and how much it cost. What's wrong, Warren?
All right. No, you keep going. Don't worry. It's all good.
Okay. Yeah. Do we need to mute on that side? There we go.
Oh, shit. 1 sec.
How is it advancing on its own, silly thing? Okay, carrying on. So we feel like trying to work out the cost of a VM, for example, in cloud is like that math problem when we were at school, trying to work out that individual cupcake and the cost. So we have a big lump sum of cost that we have at the end of the month, and we're trying to work out how much that VM costs. So in Azure, we have, let's just go back to basics here. We have some meters that get started or start ticking when you start off a resource in Azure. And for a VM, for example, would have things like the compute hours, IP address hours, data transfer in, data transfer out, disk operations, etc. Those are some of the tickers or the meters that are ticking away as soon as you start up a VM. Also, prices might be different depending on the tiers that we choose or the capacity of the resource, for example. So what are the factors that influence costs? So we have the resource type. So whether it's a VM or a storage or an app service, etc., they have different meters associated with those types. So they have different costs. Then we have services, which are basically boils down to first party versus third party. First party being the Azure development team. They're providing services in Azure to us, and there's a cost associated to those. And then third party services that are offered in the marketplace have different billing categories, for example, and billing structures. Then we have location, and what that is because of all the different data centers around the world, the cost of running a resource is different depending on the cost of electricity, the cost of the land that it exists on, things like that. And then we have zones, and zones is essentially for the data transfer out of an Azure data center. And the transfer pricing is based on billing zones. What zones are there, you may ask? 1, 2, 3, and 4, or 1, 2, 3, and Germany, for some reason. And we are in zone 3, along with Brazil and the United Arab Emirates. So billing zones or zones are not to be confused with availability zones. Availability zones is a failure protection that Azure provides between data centers. And they will always refer to availability zones, the full phrase, whereas zones on its own is the geographical zones. So a common question we have is, how much will the cloud cost? And we all know that answer. It depends, right? And it depends on what you deploy and how you architecture that deployment or that solution. So how do we work out how much something would cost beforehand? And we have tools. So one of the tools is the Azure pricing calculator. So I'm going to jump into a quick demo and show you the pricing calculator. So here are some people. Anyone have a question?
She has a problem. She usually by.
Okay, you can see the pricing calculator, right? Okay, so just if you've never used the pricing calculator, I'm just going to give you a quick overview, but I'll show you some of the cool things. So you can sign in to the calculator with an account, which then allows you to save some of your estimates and also to share estimates afterwards. And it also allows you to attach an enterprise agreement if you've got one, or another subscription type. You've got your products, and it features some products in the featured blade or pane, but it's also got some example scenarios. So you can choose an example, such as the CI/CD for Azure Web Apps, and it gives you a little architecture diagram. And you can add this to your estimate. And then your estimate is displayed down here, and it breaks it down to what it is, or breaks it down into the components. And just a trick that I want to show you is, if you scroll down to the bottom once you've added something, by default it's in dollars, but you can change it to Rand, South African Rand, and have visibility of what your solution is going to cost in Rand. And you can obviously expand on the components, but I'll get into that with another component. I'm not going to save this. I'm going to go back up here and go to products, and I'm going to add a VM, because that's what we do. We spin up VMs in Azure all the time. Right, so now if I go down to my estimate, it's defaulted back to dollars, so I'm going to just change that back to Rand just to illustrate. There it is. Okay, so I have it's suggested a VM for me. The region it's suggested is West US. Now, if you look at the top, watch the price when I change regions. So if I go to South Africa North, for example, it changed price. And pay attention to, if I change it to South Africa West, it changes. It's more expensive in South Africa West than South Africa North. Just if you didn't know, South Africa North is the Joburg data center, South Africa West is the Cape Town data centers, and you can't spin up something in ZA West by default. You have to get whitelisted in order to spin something up, and that's possibly why it's a little bit more expensive in the calculator, although I don't know. Then you've got different tiers. So basic has got no redundancy and no scalability. Low priority means that it's using spare capacity in the Azure data center, and it can be shut down by Microsoft. So you don't want to use that if it's a production environment. And standard is obviously not those, and includes a little bit more and is more expensive.
Yeah. Whitelist. Your definition of whitelist.
So if you have a subscription and you're deploying resources into Azure, you can deploy to ZA North, South Africa North, as a data center region. The other region that you would think you could deploy to is ZA West, but you can't.
Because it's the DR.
Because that data center is actually designated as DR for ZA North. And if you as an organization need to deploy resources to ZA West, you have to motivate and get permission.
So it's more for business case scenario specifically.
Yes. There is apparently, and I stand to be corrected, but you can motivate for DR deployments in ZA West. So if you're spinning up an environment that needs a DR, that you need to manually configure DR for, you can configure DR in ZA West.
And that also would require business case.
Yes, but it's up to Microsoft South Africa to give you that capability and allow it.
Is that a permanent feature, or is it just transitional whilst they're building stuff?
I don't know. Anybody in Joburg know the answer to whether that's a permanent thing or if it's just transitional because of the new data centers?
I think they're muted.
You guys are on mute. Anybody? Warren, you're muted.
Alistair muted it twice.
That'll work. Yeah, it's like a USB that goes in 3 different ways.
Okay, so now if I mute it here.
No, you're muted.
So as far as I know, it's going to stay that way. Everything is always more expensive in Cape Town.
Right.
We like to keep it exclusive.
Yep. We've got better things down here.
No, look, I think maybe when they expand, but I think for now it will remain like that for a while.
Yeah. Okay. So that's regions, and then I've just spoken about the tiers, and then you've got the instances, and the instances on a VM are t-shirt sizes of your VMs, so small, medium, large kind of thing, and you've got a whole selection. And if you actually click on pricing details in the calculator on the virtual machines and you scroll down, there's all the different sizes, and you can see some of them are not available in South Africa. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of some of the prices you've got there for different sized VMs. Then you've got reserved instances. So if you have a subscription that supports, a resource that supports reserved instances like VMs, you can pay up front and save by saying you're going to commit to a year's worth and pay up front and save, 28%, or 3 years and save 41%. And then there's a further cost saving that you can benefit from if you have software assurance on your licenses, and that's by using the hybrid use benefit. So you're saving on the license. And then obviously you've got some storage options, standard managed disks versus premium disks, or standard premium SSD, sorry. And then you can also add some support to your VM. So you do get support that is included with Azure, and that's there is some information on what is included. Somewhere you can click on the information, and it gives you a kind of breakdown of what the supports are. And if you click on the learn more, it'll tell you what's included for free. But obviously, if you want more support, then you choose one of these support options. And you can have dev or test pricing. Now, for VMs, I haven't seen prices change much. but some other instances or resource types change depending on whether it's dev or test. And I can save this and I can export it as a CSV, or sorry, as an estimate.
Do we have different licensing programs?
So this is if I've got an enterprise agreement or a CSP license agreement. I think it is. Yeah. Any other questions on the calculator?
Is the calculator really accurate in terms of what you can do in a particular site? So does it follow the resources that are there, or can you end up with a calculator that says you can have this thing, but when you get there you can't? Is there any feeling about that?
Are you talking about regions, which data centers you can deploy stuff?
There's some things you can do in certain data centers.
Yeah. I've seen the calculator say that stuff is available, and then you can't actually deploy it. Okay. So there doesn't seem to be parity between availability and the calculator.
As long as you know.
It's trying to be. It's a tool for estimating.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not 100% correct. But anybody have any comments? Neil, do you have comments on the calculator? Cool. Just go back to my presentation quick. Make sure they can see it. Nope. Sorry, guys. Okay. So, who is responsible for cloud costs? There's your CFO, CIO, all these different departments within IT or that are responsible for the costs in cloud. And so it's not necessarily just the CFO that holds the purse strings that controls the costs in cloud, because other departments, other people have access to deploy resources into the cloud. They need to be responsible for the cost that is being associated to that resource. So, we're saying it's a community of people within an organization that are responsible for the cost. And we spoke about this in the beginning of these sessions, and essentially there's a different financial model to cloud, and this just gives you an overview. So we've got on the on-premises side where you own the hardware, you have a CapEx expenditure where you own those assets and they reflect on the balance sheet, whereas in cloud, those resources appear as a profit versus loss scenario. Because you own those assets on premises, you have potentially increased business value, whereas in cloud, it reduces your net profit. But on premises, it's going to reduce your taxes via depreciation. And in cloud, you're not paying tax on those assets that you have. Okay, so you're not subject to the tax. So the other question is, will cloud be cheaper? Again, that depends. But as a scenario, we've got Tailwinds Traders, a famous organization, and they want to migrate 3 physical Windows 2008 R2 servers. Anybody here still running 2008? What? 95 desktops? That's scary. And in case you don't know, Windows 2008 went out of support on the 14th of January this year. So if you want support for 2008 and 2008 R2, you have to pay for extended support. And it starts off cheap for the first year. I think it's $50 a unit, and then it doubles every year. So it gets exponentially expensive as you go.
You haven't worked out the price on 2008 R2 by this time.
Yeah. Well, but there are people that are running legacy things that depend on it that can't upgrade. So, okay, so I'm going to show you the total cost of ownership tool, and we'll just have a look at some of the things with 3 servers in Azure versus on-premises. I'm just going to share my entire screen. All right, so the total cost of ownership tool, it's another tool. There's the URL pricing TCO calculator. Again, you can sign in so that you can save these reports and export them. And so I've got a workload, and I've specified 3 Windows servers, and they're physical servers on premises. So I'm going to input them as physical servers with 2 processors per server with 1 core per processor, and I've got some database or a database and some storage, and I've got options to configure the networking. Obviously, you can add different on-premises resources to your workloads in the TCO.
Just the RAM that you added to that?
Sorry?
The RAM.
The RAM.
1 gig.
Yeah.
That doesn't really qualify as
It doesn't, no. Okay, let's do 32 gigs of RAM, shall we? All right. So there are obviously adjustments that I can add. Probably want to change the currency again, South African Rand. So you can add your software assurance coverage, your SQL software assurance coverage. Are we going to be replicating data between regions? So geo-redundant storage. We don't want B series VMs, so we're switching this toggle on so that the TOC doesn't recommend B series VMs. And then obviously we would have to have done some homework here and figure out what the electricity cost is per kilowatt, etc., and input these things. The calculator does take a standard from, I think it says at the top where it comes from, but it's using a standard that has been provided, but you can obviously adjust it. There's IT labor costs and other assumptions. If we go to data center, for example, we can scroll down and input the data center construction cost per rack, the data center useful life, how long that data center is would stick around for, and then it generates a nice report. And over 5 years, we would save as much as 10 million Rand. Is that right? Yeah.
Azuma.
Yeah. So, look at the graph, the on-premises costs versus the cloud costs. The things you have, like the things that you don't consider when you're doing a simple calculation of a VM, you obviously think about the compute cost, the storage cost, the networking cost, and having the VM, but you don't consider the electricity cost, the cooling costs, the labor costs, security, the rental. There's a whole lot of things that you don't necessarily consider, and you need to consider those when you're comparing on-premises costs versus cloud costs. And I mean, have a look at this breakdown. If I scroll down and show you the IT labor, for example. So on premises, they're looking at 80 hours of IT labor. And in the cloud, they're only looking at 50 hours of labor. But there is still a cost associated with IT labor because you still have to manage those resources to some degree. The data center costs would obviously be zero, right? So, you can expand all of these things and get a breakdown of what the difference is.
The data center, data room costs, you can tweak them to be as close as your actual on-prem cost.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's on step 2 in the calculator, you can tweak it to meet your data center costs that you know. I mean, you know what you. Well, it's a facilities exercise where you would know how much your cooling and your power and your security, everything that goes into that data center existing, from construction, how long it's expected to last, maintaining, fire protection, all of that. You can input those assumptions into the calculator. So it's not really apples and Windows that we're comparing. Okay, so that's the TCO. Alistair, you want to ask a question? Can't hear you, you're muted. Still muted.
I said I'm not participating.
Wow, we should celebrate that. Okay, back to presentation. Probably going to jump to another demo in a minute. Right, so one of the things that we do need to think about is, because anybody that we give access to Azure can spin up resources and affect the costs, we want to restrict who can spin up things, who can create new resources. And to do that, we use role-based access control. So on a resource group or on a subscription level, that's the scopes that we talk about. We can set an access control. So RBAC is not a pirate term. It's a term that we use for granting somebody a role that gives them access to do something. Okay. We also want to give potentially CFOs and other C-level executives access to the data costs, but we don't want them to be able to spin up resources. So we've got developers and IT departments that can spin up resources, and maybe we do want them to see the costs associated with that, but we have financial people that we don't want them to be spinning up stuff or shutting stuff down, but we want them to be able to see what the cost is. So with RBAC, we can do that. And very important, and people don't realize this, and I want to stress this, that tagging your resources is super important, because you can use those tags to define a scope. You can also use the tags in a billing mechanism, an internal billing mechanism. So if you're billing back to another department, so if you tag resources with that department name, or if it's a dev environment or production environment, you can associate costs and billing with those tags. So it's pretty important to use tags. And we can do tagging with some Azure policy. So Azure Policy will allow you to tag something automatically, because we're all human and we forget to tag stuff when we're spinning it up. We get excited about our new resource that we want to switch on and play with, and we don't bother with the tag. So there's something called Azure Policy, which will automate the tagging of resources. Right. This is just another example of how we can use Azure policies to prevent people from spinning up resources that are, or resource types that are very expensive. So we can prevent certain SKUs by using Azure policy. You can, you don't want people spinning up those M series VMs. So as an Azure policy, you restrict those resources from being spun up in a subscription, for example. Okay, how will we know if we're spending too much before we get the invoice? And that is in Azure budgets. So for Azure budgets, because I don't really have a lot of resources in my tenant to show you, I'm just going to show a quick video, because that's the simplest. The videos or the budgets. Yeah. Where is it? Here we go. No. Right. So in Azure, in the portal, we go to cost management. And we've got access to budgets. Obviously, we can create a number of different budgets and name them. And we've created a few budgets already. And as the data loads in, you can see how far that budget is along in the billing period. So we're going to create a budget, and we're going to group or we're going to scope the budget according to tags, like I mentioned earlier. If you scope it by resource group, you can actually have some actions that will shut resources down, but by default, a budget won't stop resources. It'll just alert you. So we're using a tag, the dev environment. Give it a name. Those are the billing periods, how often we reset the counters, and monthly it's been suggested based on the usage, the existing usage of $24 per month, which I think is a little bit tight since we've been very close to that level. So I would suggest we increase that budget. You can tell I've seen this video before. And then on the alert conditions, you can specify a percentage of that value, of that $50 to alert when you hit that mark, when you hit those watermarks.
Those alerts can obviously go through the whole group of people.
Yeah. So you set up an alert grouping and you create it. I can't actually remember, but I think you can create different type of alerts as well. So it's not just email-based alerts. You can set like a logic app to kick off and do other things. Send a message to Teams. Log a service ticket with ServiceNow, for example. So it's not limited to just. And then we've pinned this budget to the dashboard. So whenever I log in as demo at test EA, I see this on my dashboard, how much of my budget I've spent so far. Any questions about the budget, cost budgeting?
Multiple. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Why does this thing echo? Azure Plan. Have you talked about Azure Plan?
No. Do you want to say something about Azure Plan? I know about Azure Plan, but you go ahead and say something.
Well, no, I just want to find out if you've raised it because I wasn't listening. But Azure Plan's Microsoft's way of doing cost management inside of Azure.
Yeah.
You have to have things in place to use it, and also for partners in the room. Why is this echo so bad? Okay, if I stand here, much better. Is it on Matt's side? So, and Azure Plan helps partners look at their customers' planning as well when it comes to cost management and billing. And also the billing cycle is month to month now, as in the first till the end of the month, not the way they do it currently. Like I think it's the 5th of this or the 6th of the month, and it's a weird cycle. There are some things that you need to take into consideration with Azure Plan cost. Microsoft does take margin. How it gets billed, it's a month to month. You don't have to pay annually. There's value to using that, but understand that it's very different to what Matt has just showed you. Cool. Carry on.
Yeah, thanks. That's more for from a partner's perspective, right? Yeah.
You can also extend that to your customer.
Right. Righty. So switchy is fun. Okay, I should have just gone straight into the next demo, but so where are all our costs coming from? Because where did we spend all this money on? What did we spend it on? We've got the bill and we've paid for it already. And now we want to actually know what we spent it on. So again, another video quick. Morning, Jody. You're late. Cape Town traffic, yeah. All right, so cost analysis. Once you've got that bill, you can figure out what it is that you actually paid for, or even beforehand. So it gives you the what you've been charged for up to the point and the projected rate that you'll be charged or cost. And you can see there's a whole number of resources, and we're actually going to group by resource type so that we can drill down and see what is costing us the most, and we can see that it's virtual machines in this case. And then we can further drill down within virtual machines as the type, so we can group it by the resource itself. And then we can see like the most expensive VM is this DVM. But why is this DVM VM costing us so much? And so we can go into a table view and see that it's been running for a long time compared to the other VMs. So, you know, it's just a matter of drilling down and looking and seeing what we did and why it cost us so much. And if that's a dev VM, we might want to put some a scheduled shutdown on that VM so that we can shut it down at 6 p.m. every night automatically, because this thing has been running constantly 24 hours. So that's why we're paying so much. So as a mitigation to that cost, we just schedule it to shut down and schedule it to start up again at 8 a.m. whatever.
Do you still have to deprovision it to actually stop the billing clock? Because shutting down previously was not enough.
So that's a good question. So when you shut down a VM from inside the VM, it stops the VM, but it doesn't deallocate the VM. Okay, and what Thomas is referring to is when you deallocate a VM, it disconnects it from the compute and the RAM and the networking, but it doesn't disconnect it from the storage. So the storage cost you'll still pay for in a deallocated state. But if you stop a VM from within inside a VM, it's not deallocated. So you still pay for that compute, the networking, IP addresses, etc. When you do a scheduled shutdown, it deallocates it, as far as I know.
But for the strip outside of the VM, not inside.
Yes, yes. So it deallocates it. Yes. Alrighty. One thing that people probably don't know, because it's fairly new, in the cost. This is the advisor, sorry. But in the cost management blade, you can actually manage AWS resources and the costs of those resources as well. So it's not just Azure resources. This was announced last year at Ignite, and you can import your AWS resources and monitor them using the same things that I've shown you now at a small cost. So Azure charges you 1% of your AWS bill to manage the cost of those AWS resources.
It's a premise around central dashboard.
Yes, yes, exactly. So if you want to do the things centrally with one set of dashboards, and obviously I would assume that going forwards, Azure Arc, which is adding on-premises resources into Azure, you'd be able to manage costs of those somewhat going forwards.
Well, it'll tie into the multi-cloud versus hybrid cloud scenario, because as now you've got 10 different dashboards.
Mm.
You don't have a central view, and the CFO and the CTO will come and hound you every night. There's my spreadsheet. That's it. Not always been.
Yeah.
I don't like the spreadsheet. Is it forbidden? You don't do it, no.
Spreadsheets are forbidden.
No. Yeah. Don't work on spreadsheets.
From a billing perspective, or just in general,
yeah.
Really?
I prefer Lotus.
What?
This is a good spreadsheet.
It's not running on XP
what?
now.
Abacus.
We actually have a client that we're doing a migration from GroupWise to Exchange.
You lie still.
Yeah.
Oh my word.
Oh no, we haven't started yet.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's still to happen.
But that
Yeah.
was a wonderful product. Never died.
Yeah.
Well, nobody's hacking it like you. The guys who can is dead.
One last video is the Azure recommendations or advisor. So if you have resources that Azure reckons is costing you too much, you can save costs by taking actions on these recommendations. So in this example, there's 22 virtual machines that are underutilized. So they've spec'd them too high and they're not being utilized enough. So the recommendation is to downsize them or shut them down. And so this tool is a free tool that will advise and give you recommendations based on your usage. You can resize the VMs. I think that's pretty rudimentary. And here's the AWS management. There are other tools. So the app migration service, if you have existing apps that are published externally, you can run this tool, you give it the URL and assess how much that tool would cost you in Azure, or sorry, that app service, for example. Then there's also Azure Migrate, which allows you to, it's an amazing tool that can migrate VMs, Hyper-V VMs, as well as VMware VMs, and even physical servers to Azure. But you can use this tool to do an assessment to see how much it would cost to run those VMs in Azure. And that's it from a cost management perspective. Any questions?
Is that included migrating from AWS to Azure? Was that separate?
So you can migrate from anything potentially, as long as you can put an agent onto it. So Azure Migrate uses the Mars agent, which is it comes from the DPM backup service, Microsoft backup service. So if you can put that Mars agent onto a VM or a resource, you can migrate it.
That extra percent.
Yeah, I don't know how that would work on AWS side, but yeah, no, I don't think that's where they're saying the 1% comes from.
No, I'm
but
just teasing.
yeah,
But we'll make the assumption.
yeah, that there's an extra cost involved somewhere. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, you're going to pay for ingress data.
Yeah.
So they're going to slap a charge.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There's there's data charges egressing AWS. Microsoft aren't going to charge you to push the data into it, but if you have to get it out. So we have seen use cases where people are using AWS as a DR, and they're using ASR, which also uses the same agents, Azure Site Recovery. And so they can DR to AWS, but you pay for those egress charges, the data that egresses out of Microsoft.
Do you have somewhere, maybe if you can just put it on the Teams link, a demo of migrating the data cost calculation? So if you want to say to the customers, look, I want to get my data across, even if you just use an Azure demo for an example, this is the data, so much terabyte, how would I calculate that cost coming back or whatever?
There is actually a lovely demo on the Azure Migrate. I will put it on the team site. There's a nice table of the data cost and also how long it would take, because there's physics. You've got to get that data from one point to another. And there was actually a staggering figure in the table that we saw at Ignite in Joburg, that to migrate data from on-premises, for example, will take some time because it's physics.
Or send my storage system up to Azure.
So there is a solution for that, and that's Azure Data Box. Is it Data Box?
Yeah, the physical device that you send through.
They come in different sizes, and the one is a big trolley that comes, and this whole trolley is a whole lot of storage, and they plug it in and to your data center. But then again, there's still physics involved there, where you've got to transfer the data from your data center onto that trolley. Then the trolley gets transported.
It works quite well. No, it's far more efficient in a way in that it's trickling it up into the cloud.
Yeah.
Yes.
So especially you're trickling it up from the cloud. It's a local connection. It's a LAN connection on two clouds.
No, I got the gist of it. It's just this demos was not quite useful. You can actually sit with the client and actually show him, this is what you do, this is your concerns. Now, also then the question would be, because we're sitting in a meeting, and I had to explain to the customer, but in my layman's term, but there was no demo explaining it to him what the cost involved. So we can put that demo on Teams to do great.
Will do. I'll make a note when I'm done here.
Last question.
Sorry. Yeah.
Third-party tools, Turbonomics works into Azure, and you can actually use that to calculate. Some customers use Turbonomics quite extensively.
There are a lot of third-party tools that you can use. Obviously, you pay for those tools, but the integration, there's cost management APIs. So if you can plug into the APIs, then yeah, off you go. AvePoint have got another tool as well that also does cost management quite well, and it does tagging as from the tool. So you can tag resources, and then you can bill and report based on that. So there's lots of third-party tools.
Guys like Cisco, Raincore, ShareGate's got Overcast, and AvePoint's also got a cost management tool. It's where they're moving. Matt, what about Azure Arc?
Yeah, I mentioned Azure Arc when I was talking about the AWS cost management. So you can, as of last year, manage AWS resources, and I would expect Azure Arc to follow suit, because it's essentially managing other resources in another location. And for those that don't know what Azure Arc is, it's the ability to run an agent on a resource on premises and manage that agent in Azure, in the portal, as if it were an Azure resource.
It's also extended to AWS and Google, not just on-prem.
No, absolutely.
Didn't he listen to you earlier on? No.
I ask. He's the naughty boy in the classroom.
I'm not going to sit there and listen to Matt. My turn to sit here now. Warren's outside, and Warren comes in. I leave.
We had another question in Cape Town.
No, just wanted to find out, do you have the concept of discounts for high usage?
I don't, but
because I was reading somewhere like in AWS, they form like that, they create an organization, they combine these different accounts, and their combined usage is built as part of the organization, and so you get a discount because of the high usage of the combined account.
Yeah, so obviously Microsoft have got, and I can't speak for how it works, but they've obviously got some way of giving discounts based on your consumption, and maybe your EA agreement if you have, but
pre-committed as well.
Yeah,
you commit, you get substantial discount. You pre-commit, so you say, I commit to X amount in a year.
Yes, I know, but I also have reserve, like those reserve things we were talking about, 1 year and 3 years.
Yeah. And also you get, you might get free credits because you've got something so much, there's all sorts of mechanisms that Microsoft can use to give you, or as an incentive to be on Azure. But I can't speak to how they work and what they do. There is also from a Jody can speak to the data side, but I just want to mention that from a migrate perspective, if you're migrating data, initially there's going to be a lot of data churn, and eventually that data movement ingressing is going to it's going to reach a steady state. So it's going to it's got that hockey stick where the data churn is high in the beginning, but then it flattens out, and then you will obviously pay less once it flattens out, even though you've got all that data in.
Yeah, so just to answer about the discounts. So every Microsoft here that has software assurance is a hybrid benefit part of that. So when you migrate to cloud or migrate to Azure, you get benefits, so you get discounts. And those discounts they then apply when they do the cost analysis of what it costs to run your infrastructure or services inside Azure. Those get applied, and you can save up to something like 2% of cost on-prem. Part of that is also for each core on-prem is equal to 4 cores in Azure, which you can then also end up pooling. And yeah, so if you know that a workload is a certain size, So for example, if I want to split up a managed instance and I need to say, cool, this is a massive workload, and I have got 64 cores and I've got 100 cores. I can have for my smaller, other instances, I can say, cool, this one has 5 cores, 6 cores here, 3 cores here, so you can delete them as you choose.
And then also, I think there's quite a few incentives from Microsoft that target particular industries. So, for instance, research, or development, or education, and stuff like that. You just have to basically watch and talk to your partner that does your Microsoft agreements for the various incentives throughout the year. Because obviously they try and get more people to the cloud, but particular industries are lagging. And then they find to actually launch a program specifically targeting that industry, and then you can get discounts from that as well.
There are quite a few people that have joined us remotely. If anyone joining us via Teams has any questions, come off mute and ask a question if you want. Okay, it doesn't look like it. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Are you up next?
I believe I am.
Do we want to take a quick break or?
Yes, it is.
All right.
Yeah, let's take a body break.
Go.
At 10:30, we're coming back at 10:30.
So 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Cool. All righty.
All right.
Okay, no, awesome.
Plug it in.